This is an Advent such as few of us have experienced before, and I'm sure we all find ourselves challenged and reflecting in different ways as we come to the end of a year which has been terrible for many people on our planet. All of us have been affected in some way or another. Many have been affected by bereavement, illness, fear, loneliness, and the poorest of the poor have found themselves more abandoned and desolate than ever before. So we all know the cost of the pandemic. We all enter this Advent season with that weighing upon us, but also full of hope that there will be a vaccine, that the pandemic will be brought under control, that the new year will be different. And yet perhaps, like me, you hope that it will be a new normal, a new, more sustainable, a more life-giving ethos that unites the human family going forward. So this Advent, I feel that when the gloss and glitter of Christmas have been stripped away, we're confronted with actually the raw and messy reality of what this time of waiting means. It's a time when life is pregnant with meaning, as Mary is pregnant with Christ. I don't want to focus this reflection solely on the idea of motherhood as a kind of domestic or biological fact, but I do want to think about maternal life and what it can teach us, whoever we are, whether we're male or female or anything in between, what we can learn from the maternal experience of Advent, a time of waiting for new life to begin, but also, as any pregnancy is, a time of uncertainty and fear and anxiety. So there's a lot that I feel we can look at just through the prism of Mary this Advent, but that also means for many of us we have to get rid of a lot of the baggage. Mary is not a helpful figure for many women in the Catholic Church. For me as a convert, I have come to discover in her a hugely significant womanly and maternal presence, incarnational and sacramental, and I'll say a little about that. But I know that for many, many women who live in oppressive Catholic cultures, who were born and brought up within oppressive Catholic stereotypes, Mary needs to be liberated so that she can liberate us. And I very much hope that we can use these sessions we have together to ask how we can liberate Mary in our imagination from the shackles that patriarchy and convention have put upon us in the form of her, and how she in turn can liberate us to a more joyful and hope-filled discipleship of faith as we walk with her along that rocky and dangerous path of radical discipleship, following in darkness the Christ who is only ever one step ahead of us, but so often not clearly visible, and asking of us a great leap of faith every step along the way. So I want to begin with a little quiet reflection when we just ask ourselves, who is Mary for me? What is it about the image I carry of Mary that's oppressive and burdensome and inhibits my capacity to trust and give myself fully to the faith to which Christ invites me? And what glimmers of hope, what signs do I see that Mary could become more real for me, more a beacon of light and hope, more an expression of the fullness of women's lives and less the sort of dead hand of patriarchy controlling us and telling us what to think. So just let your images of Mary play out for a few seconds of silence and ask yourself, who is she for me and who could she become for me? As I said earlier, I'm a convert to Catholicism, and I grew up as a Scottish Presbyterian in Zambia, in Africa, and I always viewed Catholics with suspicion because I was told that they worshipped Mary. And when I began to respond to my dark and not really understood desire to make that journey into the Catholic Church, I knew I was embarking on a path of struggle and confusion, and it's been all those things and a few more. But one of my great reservations was what I would do about Mary. But shortly after I was received into the church, we came to live in England, and our 4 children were very young, and I was struggling on many levels. I was struggling with the strangeness of this new culture, and I have to say, since Brexit, I struggle even more. I was struggling with the reality of being a mother to 4 very young children in a world in which I had to start all over anew with friendships and with interests, etc. And of course, I was struggling with this newfound faith that I had entered into and now wasn't quite sure to make of. But what I discovered very, very early on was Mary became for me very quickly someone who could welcome me and hold me in a space of the symbolization and representation of women's lives, maternal life, womanly life, something about the relationality and vulnerability and hope and struggle and sorrow that I realized had been lacking from my Presbyterian upbringing, and I didn't even know I missed it until suddenly she was there for me. And there are 2 dimensions to that for me. One is Mary the woman, Mary the mother, Mary the one I can identify with. And the other is Mary, who is called to be God's partner in the sacramental healing of creation through the incarnation. And both of those are really important aspects of my own devotion to Mary. When we were first living in England, I used to take the children to school and nursery school, and I used to go into the parish church and kneel in front of the dusty, tear-stained Pietà, cradling her son on her lap. And somehow in that image of maternal sorrow and sadness and struggle, I could see my own sorrow and sadness and struggles magnified. And I could find some kind of consolation for my own fear of all the unknowns of the world I had entered. So there is that very real personal existential relationship for me. But there is also the discovery through my theological studies, and paradoxically I went on to do a PhD on Marian studies, the realization that for the early and medieval church, Mary represented the cosmic power of God's healing of the wound of alienation and estrangement that humankind has suffered because of whatever form our rebellion took, whether you call it original sin or something else, whatever we call it, however we explain it, we know that we are in a world where there's too much that goes wrong. There's too much violence. There's too much injustice that we cry out against. And our pre-modern forebears understood Mary as very much part of this healing from within of creation. She was the voice of creation, opening a way for us to be reconciled with God in Christ. Of course, God was never distanced from creation, but we were distanced from God, and therefore in some sense also from the creation of which we were part. And in this era of environmental crisis, that seems to me a really important rediscovery. We get some of it through Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si, although I have problems with the way that rather romanticizes Mother Earth. Mother Earth becomes a bit like Real Woman, a kind of vulnerable, wounded, waiting for men to rescue her. I want to bring a more robust ecology into that and a more robust Mariology, but I also want to recover that vision of Mary as the one in whom the harmonies of creation are being restored. And if we can learn to dance in tune to the music of creation, if we can follow her along that rocky path of pilgrimage, which requires nimble footwork and a keen eye for all that might deflect us or oppress us, I think there's much to be discovered in that great cosmic mother figure. So I'm going to just ask us to reflect for a little bit on St. Anselm's prayer to Mary. I've just taken a short extract here, but I think it does express something of that enormity of Mary as a sacrament of creation almost. So let's look at that. Lady, full and overflowing with grace, all creation receives new life from your abundance. Virgin, blessed above all creatures, through your blessing all creation is blessed. Not only creation from its creator, but the creator himself has been blessed by creation. The whole universe was created by God, and God was born of Mary. God created all things, and Mary gave birth to God. He who could create all things from nothing would not remake his ruined creation without Mary. God then is the father of the created world, and Mary the mother of the recreated world. God is the Father by whom all things were given life, and Mary the mother through whom all things were given new life. Without God's Son, nothing could exist. Without Mary's Son, nothing could be redeemed. Now that is a vast vision of Mary's power and cosmic significance, and it's worth noting in this context that in the early church, in the very early church, references to Mary's virginity were not about morality and sexual abstinence first and foremost. They were about that renewal of creation. Virginity symbolized the breaking in of God into history to make something altogether new, and it was something undomesticated, untamed, not subjugated to human power and domination. And in this sense, Mary's virginity becomes a wild force of nature. We still use virginity in that context today when we speak of the virgin forest, the virgin ocean. It's where man has not ruled and God's creation shines forth in all its pristine goodness. And I wonder if we can recover that sense of what virginity means, which is altogether different from the domesticated, subjugated sexual inhibition that it's so often used to impose upon women. But we're more used to this kind of image. Mary, the docile young girl, kneeling humbly before the angel, saying yes to God. And we don't hear enough about the fact that Mary had choice. She wasn't told she was pregnant. She was asked to consent to pregnancy. And I think we all know what a difference there is between finding that one has conceived without consenting to it and conceiving a child one very much wants. Every woman has to navigate this difficult terrain, no matter whether we want or don't want children, no matter what kind of relationships we have, celibate, sexual, married, single, whatever, whether we long for children and can't have them or find that we're having more children than we can cope with. We all have to face these aspects of what it means to be a woman. And I think what we need to retrieve from Mary's yes in the Annunciation is the fact that the vocation to maternal life, the vocation to nurture and care for and bring to the fullness of personhood another vulnerable human, is something that requires a response, and it requires assent, and it requires skill and training and discipline and love. It doesn't just come with conception. St. Augustine said Mary conceived first in her mind and then in her womb. But we also know that sometimes women conceive in their wombs and they don't conceive in their minds. We have to conceive of ourselves as mothers in order to mother well. So this Annunciation is not just telling Mary about a biological conception, important though that is. We mustn't minimize the reality of bodily life and all that it means. But it's an invitation to a vocation. And I believe every Christian has that vocation to maternal life, if maternal life means that courageous, fierce, protective love, discerning who the most vulnerable is and looking out for that person, enabling each and every one to come to the fullness of their own being through the fullness of our being. Can we reclaim that vision of Mary? Well, that's a big question. But what I want to do is to just look at a few different images of the Annunciation. They're images that remind us that wherever the Christian message goes, Mary goes. And artists throughout the world have been inspired to represent this moment in many different ways that reflect the ways in which the Incarnation seeds itself and grows from different contexts and different cultures. So in the next slide, I'm just looking at some global images, if you like, of the Annunciation with a little bit of music to go with it.
Oh, Hail Mary, congratulations, gracious lady, the Lord want to bless you. Oh, Hail Mary, congratulations, gracious lady, the Lord is with you. Oh, Hail Mary, congratulations, gracious lady, the Lord want to bless you. Oh, Hail Mary, congratulations, gracious lady, the Lord is with you. These were the greetings from Angel Gabriel on his one visit to Nazareth. Oh, Hail Mary, congratulations, gracious lady, the Lord is with you. Oh, these were the greetings from Angel Gabriel.
So I could go on. There are thousands of images like that once we begin to look. But we might also ask, apart from this last astonishing abstract image from an Armenian artist, we might also say, in all these images, really does the representation of Mary fundamentally change? Maybe, maybe not. I leave you to make your minds up on that. But what is happening today is that more and more women artists, including feminist artists, are coming forward to say, what does Mary look like from where we stand if we look at her not through the male gaze, but through the female gaze, through a woman's eyes? Who might we see and how might that be different? So I want to look at a few more images now, again with a little bit of music to inspire our reflections.
I will not believe that I'm the only one who has that dream. No, it doesn't have to be that way. What will it take to make you believe the change is coming? I know the change is coming. It's coming. I know the change is coming.
I love this last image by American artist Mary Croteau. But it also makes me think, you know, I haven't shown them here, but I could have done. There are some quite violent images of the Annunciation when a very macho angel appears on the scene and Mary appears to flinch or to cower or to be terrified. Now, I'm sure there was terror in that. None of us really wants an angelic Annunciation. It's challenging and full of risk. But even so, in tradition, the angel is androgynous, and I find that a very interesting way to reflect upon the Annunciation. But sometimes the angel is a wolf in sheep's clothing. Sometimes we're asked to accept very masculine angels and very humble, subdued virgins. And that's when we have to tell the angel to get packing, as Mary does here. There are angels we shouldn't allow into our lives with their visitations because they're normally patriarchal ideologues wearing angels' wings to deceive us. So we need discernment, we need patience, we need prayer, and we need ultimately to have the freedom to choose to make up our own minds about what we say yes to and why. I want to move on to the last bit of this with this beautiful Annunciation by Fra Angelica painted in the 15th century. There's a lot about this image, and I'm going to try to be quite brief, but I spoke earlier about the redemption of creation in Mary, and there is this insight in the best of our tradition that the incarnation is a great act of reconciliation, of harmonization of the beauty of the music of creation that was disrupted by whatever we choose to call the human rebellion against God. And that here, when Mary says yes, Christ enters back into the atoms and quarks and life of the universe in a material way in Mary's womb, and everything begins to be healed. So here we have this beautifully dignified encounter where the angel and Mary meet one another's eyes. A friend of mine says, you know, this is the birth of humanism, when Mary makes eye contact with the angel. I love that. But note the dignity in both their poses. There's no domination here. There's no authoritative, you must do this. There's a world coming into being in the space between two, where the Spirit of God shines into the relationship and the healing begins. Adam and Eve are shown in this image, not being driven out of the garden in agony and anguish, but to me, it's a reconciling and healing image. Of course, Mary is known as the new Eve in the tradition, and although we might think of this as a very oppositional, dualistic image, because that's what the modern church has, again, in the very early church, Mary was called Eve's advocate. She was the one in whom Eve was redeemed, and the wounds of creation, the wounds of alienation were healed. Mary was also, incidentally, in the early church, given the title the Rational Paradise. And this was a way to hold together that, yes, she was the virgin earth of paradise from whom the second Adam was made and in whom creation was renewed. But she was also a rational person who could weigh up her decision and who could assent freely to God. And I love that title for that reason. But also down in the bottom here, we have scenes from the life of Mary, and we first encounter that story in the 2nd century text, the Proto-Evangelium of James. Again, there's a lot I could say, but one of the characters in the story of Mary's life is her mother, Anna, and her father, Joachim. And the belief was that Anna was like Hannah in the Hebrew Bible, mother of Samuel. She was an elderly woman who didn't have a child. And Anna and Joachim mourned the lack of a child. But an angel appeared to Anna, and there's a beautiful image that informs much medieval art of the kiss at the Golden Gate. Joachim has been exiled into the wilderness because of his failure to conceive a child. Interestingly, it's unusual for the man to be blamed for that, but in this story, he is. And an angel appears to Anna and says, Joachim is also seeing an angel, and he's coming to the gates of the city. Go and meet him, because you're going to have a child. And they fall into one another's arms and embrace at the Golden Gate of Jerusalem. Google that image. And the Catholic Church has always taught, actually, that Mary was sexually conceived. She was conceived without original sin, but she was conceived through the sexual union of her parents. Again, I leave you to reflect on that. And again, I know the question of Mary's sinlessness has been a terribly oppressive doctrine for women. But, you know, I love to think of it as the gift God gave Mary of guilt-free motherhood. I don't know a woman that I've ever had a deep conversation with whose life is not, in one sense or another, or tormented by guilt. We are brought up to believe it's our fault when things go wrong, and the maternal relationship can be the most blighted by that sense of guilt and failure. And guilt is toxic. It poisons our relationships. It prevents us just accepting that we make mistakes. Sometimes we make really damaging mistakes, but surely the message of our faith is there is always forgiveness. There is always healing for one another, for ourselves, and from God. So for me, Mary's conception without sin is about her suffering all the grief and struggle and pain that goes with mothering, that goes with answering a vocation. But her relationships were not poisoned by guilt. She was able to experience a purity of grief, a purity of being in all the sort of existential reality of who she was. So Anna is the mother of Mary, and Anna is the grandmother of Christ. So in this lovely ancient legend, we see women being reconciled and women entering the story. The Belgian psychoanalytic theorist Luce Irigaray points out that the mother-daughter relationship is one of the first victims of patriarchy. Of course, the father-son relationship is elevated in the doctrine of the Trinity and in Christian teaching. But in Mary and Anne, the mother-daughter relationship is rehabilitated. And, you know, I think that's part of the healing we need, is the healing of relationships between and among women across generations, kinship groups and relationships, because patriarchy has a hidden instinct of divide and rule. Mothers and daughters are set against each other, mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law, women at different positions in the spectrum. We all know that in our experiences. There may be some women here who feel quite conservative in their faith, who don't want to change their image of Mary, who want things to be as they are because they see great beauty and consolation and inspiration in the tradition as they understand it as it is now. And there are others who are restless and hungry for radical change and champing at the bit for things to be different. And very often these groups of women find it extremely difficult to engage in dialogue and try to understand one another. But unless we can do that, they will always use us, to destroy the capacity we have to stand in solidarity and bring about change for the best of all women, because we all want the same thing. We all want a world in which love can flourish. We all want a world in which there's peace, freedom from violence, justice, and care for the most vulnerable. Who doesn't want that? The challenge is to see that even if we come from different perspectives, we share the same vision, and we must find ways to stand together. So with that, I want to end, of course, with one of the most beautiful images of female solidarity. This is by a Chaldean Iraqi Christian who was a refugee from Iraq and now, as a child, and now lives in the United States. I haven't made a note of her name, for which my apologies, but I will put her name up on the screen at the end when I look it up. But we have an oppressive image of the visitation, that Mary is kind of burdened with her pregnancy, but even so, she does her duty as every good woman does and trudges off to visit her elder cousin. But I don't think it was like that. And this image suggests something of what it was about. For Mary, pregnant, to make that journey across the desert, compelled by the desire to find the other woman who understands what's happening to her. You know, it's a miracle of the Annunciation that when Mary says, "How can this be?" she's told there is someone else. Know this to your cousin Elizabeth. So often when we find ourselves facing perplexing, challenging, distressing situations, we just want an escape, and the escape doesn't come. But we need to learn to look for the other who is given to us, the companion along the way. And for Mary, Elizabeth was given to her in the challenge of the Annunciation. And at the foot of the cross, she was not left alone. The women were there for her too. And we know the women went together on that pre-dawn darkness of the morning of the resurrection. They were there for each other there too. So here we have this moment when the incarnation is shared for the first time between humans. And who is it who shares it? It's two pregnant women, improbably pregnant in time out of time, sharing their joy and their vulnerability and their hope and their visions and their fears. And I just want to leave you with this image and to go back again to that silent musical reflection, maybe for you to hold this image in your imagination and return to that question we started with: who is Mary for me? Thank you for inviting me to be with you through these reflections. It's very much for me a personal sharing. You will all have different ways of approaching the issues we're looking at here, and I look forward to later in the month when we can have a discussion about that. So I leave you for now, and with my prayers and hoping that the week ahead is good for you.